Alaska is home to the largest sustainable wild salmon fishery in the world. With over 5,000 miles of coastline and more than 12,000 miles of rivers and streams, Alaska's waters support all 5 Pacific salmon species, from the mighty king to the plentiful pink. During the annual spawning run in Alaska's thousands of lakes, rivers, and streams, salmon fry are hatched from eggs where they grow to tiny fingerlings, or smolts, before heading out to sea the following spring. Fattened by the richness of the ocean and ready for harvest by Alaska fishermen, salmon return to spawn in the same rivers, each species on their own life cycle. Alaska wild salmon is considered the gold standard in U.S. and world markets, both for its safety and high quality. Alaska is also recognized worldwide as the model for a sustainable, healthy salmon fishery due to best-in-class fishery management practices.
There are 5 species of salmon that are harvested in Alaska: the king salmon, the coho salmon, the sockeye salmon, the pink salmon, and the chum salmon.
This is a healthy fishery. There's 5 stocks. This year in particular was a really good year for salmon in Alaska. Almost all the runs were healthy. There was one area perhaps that was down, but for the most part this is a healthy fishery, a healthy population, and it's not a surprise to any of us that the Marine Stewardship Council recently reapproved their certification. Very good. It's a very well managed fishery.
Alaska wild salmon are a sustainably managed natural resource that also support Alaska's fishing industry and coastal communities. In fact, sustainable management is a governing principle in Alaska's Constitution and is reflected in the Alaska Seafood brand. Recognized by the Marine Stewardship Council, the Alaska wild salmon fishery was the first in the world to merit MSC certification for sustainable management. Salmon return to Alaska in large volumes each year, making it the 4th largest fishery in the U.S. In 2007, for example, Alaska's salmon harvest topped 212 million fish.
Roughly 400,000 metric tons. In Alaska, that's our 2nd largest fishery after pollock.
This season in Alaska, from the data I got from Fish and Game, we had 212 plus million fish harvested in the state for nearly 1 billion pounds of round weight of salmon.
During the 2007 season, more than 212 million salmon were caught in Alaska, yielding 566 million pounds of salmon flesh and byproducts. This is a valuable and sustainable natural resource that returns every year.
While our salmon fisheries are well managed and the stocks are sustainable, they are finite and they are not infinite. And if we want to add to the value of the resource to make this fishery and the whole industry here more sustainable economically, we need to begin to create value for those parts of the fish which currently cost the industry money and therefore make the value of salmon lower because they are costing to dispose of and to comply with governmental regulation during the disposal.
Salmon in Alaska are managed by the state, Alaska Department of Fish and Game. They're doing an excellent job. The stocks are healthy. As you're aware, they have a Marine Stewardship Council label that we're all very proud of. In terms of the health of the fish, quality of the fish, lack of contaminants, it's an excellent product. I think one of the goals in almost any well-managed fishery is full utilization of the entire product. And I think one of the things that's remarkable about this approach of this fishery is that it can use essentially byproducts. It can take advantage of the flesh in terms of the meat market. It can take advantage of fatty acids. It can take advantage of a whole suite of things. And that full utilization is it's something that all the fisheries are trying to achieve.
Basically, since the beginning of the salmon processing industry in Alaska, which is over 100 years ago, traditionally those byproducts, which include the viscera, the heads, the fins, the tails, any part that is not included in the final product, has been dumped in the nearshore marine environments through single source point discharge pipes, which Also can create environmental issues in that they create BOD loads, biological oxygen demand loads, and can create other nuisances for navigation and hazards. And it's just completely a waste of a valuable resource.
You know, it's been a long time, and we're just now addressing some of these issues, and we find out that there are more uses for the byproducts than ever before. It's nothing new that we've known about it, but finding a use for it, and fish oils, of course, are part of that resource. But the biggest resource, I think, is going to be in the byproducts of fish processing, particularly salmon. And Alaska has a huge resource up there that we haven't used. We've actually abused it for many years. So the fish oils there will play a bigger part, I think, in human health and the treatment of arthritis, for instance, heart diseases, and I take fish oil every day. So it's worth it.
We initially got into these projects with the USDA, and we called them waste. And then the next idea was, well, there isn't really waste. You can make a lot of money off this material. Nothing else. You can make protein meals, you can make oils.
I'm the co-investigator of a project that aims at characterizing byproducts from the salmon industry in order to better utilize the resources. We chemically characterize the different tissues, say salmon head, salmon livers, gonads, milt, roe, and so forth. And we also try to find better uses for it. We try to add value to these products by processing the products, let us say making a better quality fish meals, or trying to purify the oils extracted from these tissues for human use because of the content of omega-3 fatty acids.
You have fish oils that are going to be, I think, an abundant resource and recoverable, will be available for human consumption.
What are some of the unique advantages of making these materials out of some of the byproducts we have? And this is very, very important. And first of all is that right now the world is going into a sustainable mode. They want materials that are made from sustainable industries. In Alaska, which is where I'm from, and I'm speaking about this specifically, but our salmon industry, our pollock industry, our halibut industry, and so forth are designated as sustainable industries by outside agencies.
Alaska has a leg up on everyone else, yes, because the salmon, are short-lived anyway, and so it's a recoverable, sustainable resource, and we know through extensive investigations of the chemical analysis for pollutants that they're absolutely free of these, and so the consumer shouldn't worry about this at all.
What is the potential for getting oil? Most of the oil comes out of the head. Some species store oils in livers, such as pollock. Salmon stores most of the oil in the head. If we take all these heads that we talked about 2 slides ago, we would have roughly 8,000 metric tons of oil in that ballpark, maybe another 1,000 metric tons from viscera, and so forth and so on. Right now in Alaska, there are people that are making commercial quantities of pink and red salmon oils, and there's a lot of room to grow here. And all thought of this material is underutilized. We are making nowhere near the total amount of material that you have listed up here.
Making this product, we're actually utilizing parts which for the past 100 years have literally been thrown away, and we've discovered a method by which we can take some of those parts and in a very gentle process extract oil from them.
Many of the fish oils are coming from the fish byproducts, and that's why recovery of the byproducts is so important today, that we've been wasting this resource.
We utilize byproducts from all 5 of those species in the same proportion in which they're harvested in the commercial fisheries to produce one Alaska salmon oil product, and not try to differentiate between the 5 species, which are actually very, very similar in in unsaturated and saturated fat contents. Overall fat content may vary between species and between rivers. With systems that have much longer ranges like the Copper River and the Yukon River, those fish need a lot more energy and oil therefore in their tissues to make it the 2,000 miles up these rivers, whereas short rivers they may have lower overall oil concentration. We see a lot of that kind of variability, but overall between and among species and in between and among years we see the proportion of unsaturated fats to monosaturated and polyunsaturated fats to be relatively stable and quite high, naturally high, and very good for you, as we all know at this point in life.
As up here in Alaska, in this northern latitude and so forth, we're dealing with cold water marine species. As a generality, these have high levels of the 3 omega fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA. This is a real big deal right now.
So we're interested in fundamentally all of the fish oils, but basically we're really focusing on omega-3s. Many years ago, when Maurice Stansby, formerly the director of the Utilization Technology program at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, had worked on fish oils for human consumption at that point in time. That point in time is really back in the 1970s through the 80s. And so fish oils and their benefits to human consumption have been known for a long time. We're just getting around to really appreciating it and using them.
The fish oils that are produced from Alaska byproducts, especially salmon head, will have a very high omega-3 content, very low omega-6 content, and therefore these oils have unique properties and incredible benefits to human health.
The omega-3 cardiac story goes back 30 or 40 years to the first observations of Dyerberg and Bang, two scientists from Denmark who discovered that Greenland Eskimos, who were eating a completely natural native diet, very high in cholesterol, very high in saturated fat and total fat, were having very few heart attacks, far less than they would have expected based on the paradigm of the day that a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet causes heart attacks. So this was a real anomaly, and they finally figured out it was because of the omega-3 fatty acids that were in their diet from the seafood. And this is what's missing from the Western diet was the long-chain EPA, DHA, omega-3s. That observation in the late 70s really sparked the entire omega-3 research agenda. And it began in cardiovascular disease, and it remains cardiovascular, I think, is the most compelling story. The far most well-supported data is in benefits in cardiovascular disease.
You can look at it, we can take all the fish and we can make a meal or an oil, or we can take parts and take each one of these parts and add value to them. And that's going to turn out to be, I think, a very, very fruitful strategy. In fact, it's starting to be used by some companies already.
The utilization of those byproducts for profit, for creation of products which can generate at least a break even, if not a profitable point, will do a lot to change the value of the overall salmon fishery for the fishermen, for the processors, and ultimately for the people of the state of Alaska, who benefit as well from the higher value and higher yield of products from that resource.
One of the benefits of consuming fish oil from Alaska is that you can be assured that this fish oil is coming from wild resources.
My name is Dr. William Harris. I am a professor of medicine at the University of South Dakota School of Medicine, Sanford School of Medicine, and I work at the Sanford Research Institute there, where I'm a senior scientist. I've been in the omega-3 research field for about 30 years. Currently, I'm a fellow with the American Heart Association. When we think about intakes of omega-3 and heart health, we need to think about two different dose levels. One dose level is high dose, which is 3 to 4 grams of EPA plus DHA, the long-chain omega-3s. 3 to 4 grams a day, which comes, you can get in a pharmaceutical preparation in 4 capsules. If you go to dietary supplements, you're talking about 11 to 17 capsules a day of dietary supplements to get that much omega-3. That dose is good for lowering blood triglyceride levels. Now there's a completely different dose, a very much lower dose, about 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day probably. That is good for heart health, reduces the risk for fatal heart attacks, but doesn't have any effect on the blood triglycerides. And so both of these are good. It's just that one should not expect from the lower dose to see a change in the blood lipid or fat patterns. The cholesterol or triglyceride in the blood is not going to change on this lower dose, the about 1 gram of omega-3. And so it's something people often get confused. They think they're going to get a big triglyceride effect from taking enough just to protect the heart, but they're not.
The evidence showing benefits of omega-3 fatty acids on cardiovascular disease are most impressive. There are 5 epidemiologic studies or population studies that have been conducted in the United States that show that consuming about 500 milligrams per day of EPA-DHA markedly reduces risk of coronary heart disease. And what we know is about 500 milligrams per day is equivalent to about 2 servings of fatty fish per week. Now, beyond the population data, or the observational data, we have evidence from randomized controlled clinical trials that show marked benefits of fish and fish oil on cardiovascular events. And randomized controlled clinical trials are the gold standard for making treatment guidelines. So on the basis of 3 major studies, we know that fish oil, fish consumption can markedly decrease risk of the first cardiac event as well as secondary events in people who have already had heart disease. Oh, it's very impressive evidence. Sudden cardiac death is considered one of the leading causes of cardiac death in the United States. About 340,000 people die per year from sudden cardiac death. And it's defined as death from heart disease within 1 hour after a heart attack. So you can see the magnitude of the effect of something so simple as consuming fish or taking fish oil supplements on this very leading cause of death in the United States and worldwide. The American Heart Association recommends 2 fish meals, preferably fatty fish meals, per week to prevent coronary heart disease. For patients who already have heart disease, they recommend 1 gram a day, and that's under supervision of a physician, and that pretty much has to be gotten with a supplement. And then for triglyceride lowering, they need 2 to 4 grams a day, and more like 3 to 4 grams a day. The recommendations made by American Heart Association are made both for men and women. There's really no difference in what we expect to occur on the basis of gender.
Now we can think about omega-3 at 2 different dose levels. One at a high dose, 3 to 4 grams a day, which will lower blood triglycerides, which is a good thing. And then there's what we typically call a cardioprotective dose. That is about 1 gram, maybe 500 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams, 1 gram, of EPA and DHA, which will protect the heart against sudden arrhythmias. And so that's a dose we think is certainly achievable nutritionally without having to take any pills. And so cardioprotection can be achieved with a diet change alone. Yeah, the question of can you take too much omega-3 has been asked a lot. And in practice, you really can't. The usual Eskimo intake was always thought to be about 7 or 8 grams. Yeah, we know that the omega-3 fatty acids in pretty high doses, again, this 3 to 4 grams a day, are effective at lowering the blood triglyceride level. And triglyceride is one of the 2 lipids that we look at in the blood, primarily cholesterol and triglycerides. And it lowers the triglycerides by 2 actions. One, it causes the body to make less triglycerides and actually secrete them into the blood, so that lowers levels. Plus, it accelerates the removal of triglyceride from the blood. In terms of the other components, the cholesterol components, we always think about 2 different kinds of cholesterol: LDL, low-density lipoprotein; HDL, the good one, LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, HDL is the good. Fish oils don't lower the bad cholesterol. per se, unless they're just the fish oil is substituting for a more saturated fat. Then the LDL cholesterol, the bad, will go down. There is some effect of the fish oils on raising the good cholesterol, but the principal impact is not on the good or the bad cholesterol, but it's on the triglycerides. What do we do to lower cholesterol? And one of the ways nutritionally to do that is to eat diets that are higher in polyunsaturated fatty acids, liquid oils instead of solid fats. Solid fats typically from animals, liquid oils typically from plants. But fish oils are also a kind of an anomaly because they're from an animal, but they're also liquid at room temperature, so they're very polyunsaturated. So there was interest in knowing what the fish oils do to cholesterol level. We knew that the plant oils would lower cholesterol. And from Framingham, we thought that was a good thing. And so some people started studying fish oils too in the early, actually in the 1950s. And they saw that the fish oils will lower cholesterol. And we're talking about the omega-3 fatty acids. It's one of two classes of what we call essential fatty acids. In the same way that some vitamins and minerals are essential in our diet because we can't make them. Essential fatty acids are fats that cannot be made that we need for our health and well-being. And the two classes are the omega-6 and the omega-3 class.
The ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s is unbalanced in the United States right now. And that's primarily because of corn and other grain oils. Corn I mentioned because it is over half omega-6 precursors. So the ideal ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids in your diet is debatable. And definitely fish require more omega-3s than humans do. But it's thought that in humans the ratio should be more like 1 to 5 on 1 part omega-3 to 5 part omega-6. Well, right now in America we're more like 1 to 15 and 1 to 20.
One way to think about it is both the precursors for omega-3 and omega-6 long-chain fatty acids go through the same cellular machine which turns them into these prostaglandins and leukotrienes and things which regulate an inflammatory response. And the ones from the omega-6, they're a little more powerful, so they create a strong inflammation response. And it's those inflammation responses that give you things like heart disease, they give you things like asthma.
There's even some new studies coming out to show that omega-3 fatty acids are important to the elderly and can help improve their mental function and ward off the problem of dementia.
There is some emerging evidence that's pretty impressive from population studies that higher intakes of omega-3 fatty acids in fish per se is associated with a slower loss of mental function in older people. There have been 2 or 3 studies like that right now. We have better evidence that the omega-3s are beneficial for premature babies, ones who are born too early. For visual function and mental function, the omega-3s really seem to help a lot.
New and emerging evidence that fish consumption throughout life can decrease risk of Alzheimer's and age-related dementia. And one such study from Framingham showed that people who consumed fish 2 to 3 times a week had about a 40% reduction in age-related dementia and Alzheimer's. A study conducted by the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis showed that mothers who ate fish during their pregnancy had children that had slightly higher IQs when they were about 6 years old compared to mothers who didn't eat fish during pregnancy. And I think that the message here is that during pregnancy we don't want women to avoid fish, and there could be benefits in terms of their baby's health and their child's health long term.
Sometimes women are told, especially when they're pregnant, that they should be careful how much fish they eat because there could be mercury in the fish that might harm their unborn baby. And sometimes when people hear that, they think, well, I'm just going to be really safe and I'm not going to eat any fish at all while I'm pregnant. And that's a really bad advice and a really bad decision. And so we spend a lot of time trying to educate women about how important it is to eat fish while you're pregnant, because those omega-3 fatty acids in fish are very important to the developing brain of the baby. At the state of Alaska, when we're trying to develop consumption advice for fish, we don't just look at contaminants, because we want to provide overall the best advice for what's the healthiest thing to eat. And we know in Alaska that people really rely on fish, especially in the rural areas, and that they don't have a lot of healthy choices or other types of things to eat. And so we're always careful to look at both the slight risks of contaminants, but also the potential health benefits of fish to develop the most balanced advice. And we're very concerned, actually, that people are getting the message that fish isn't safe to eat. And we think that's wrong. We think that it's terrible advice, and we encourage people to eat fish as much as they want.
The American Heart Association is recommending a food-based approach to achieve the new 206 diet and lifestyle recommendations. And they recommend 2 servings of fish, preferably fatty fish, per week. And along those lines, of course, cold water Alaskan salmon is terrific.
Another important piece of information about Alaska fish oils is the fact that we have analyzed several commercial fish oils produced in Alaska, not only pink salmon, sockeye salmon, but also pollock and cod and so on and so forth. And all the oils we have analyzed for contaminants have shown very low level of contaminants, very low level of mercury and PCBs and also other organic contaminants, pollutants that can be found in higher levels in, let us say, menhaden oil or anchovy oil and so forth.
The analysis of the fish tissue that we're doing in the state, most of it's being done in the state. All the heavy metals analysis is being done at the Environmental Health Laboratory in Anchorage. The state's been very committed to this project in trying to determine if environmental contaminants are impacting our state resources. I started working for the state in 2001, where we started this fish monitoring program. The primary objective of the program was to develop an analysis of Alaskan seafood and fishes to determine if they were being impacted by environmental contaminants. We had a number of reports throughout the world and throughout the United States that contaminants were impacting the food that we eat. And being up in Alaska in a far remote area, we were concerned that we know these contaminants can travel long distances. So long-range transport of many of these environmental contaminants, like the persistent organic pollutants that are long-lived, they don't degrade very much in the environment, they can be transported on wind and water and unfortunately can impact very remote areas like up in the Arctic. So the state started this program to go ahead and collect fish from across the state of Alaska, both marine and freshwater fish, to determine if we could find any of these contaminants in the fish. We've selected probably about 500 fish a year since 2001 and have analyzed them for a number of different contaminants, both heavy metals or trace metals as well as persistent organic pollutants. The trace metals, we look at mercury, both total mercury and methyl mercury, look at arsenic, cadmium, chromium, nickel, selenium, and lead. And the persistent organic pollutants, mostly the organochlorines we're looking at, PCBs, dioxins and furans, as well as a number of 38 different pesticides and some of the new emerging contaminants, and that's one of the big concerns that we face now, such as the polybrominated fire retardants, or the PBDEs. So we've gone ahead and analyzed quite a number of fish, almost 3,000 over this since this last year for these contaminants. The fish monitoring program is a very complicated program in the fact that we've got a large state in a very remote area of the world. We're sticking out into the North Pacific. So we rely on a lot of collaborative partners to help us with the collection of fish and the interpretation of the data. We're working with a number of state agencies, both Department of Fish and Game, the Department of Health and Social Services, also a number of federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, the International Pacific Halibut Commission, and National Marine Fisheries. All are collaborative partners with the collection and actually the analysis of the data. But we're also looking at help from commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, subsistence fishermen in getting our samples to the laboratory. We don't have a lot of industry or industrial sources for these contaminants in Alaska, but we know that they're up here, and most of the time they're from long-range transport from more temperate areas of the globe, and they're carried across the Pacific from the Asian continent and unfortunately deposited here in Alaska. The good news is that these contaminants, we're finding them in very, very low concentrations within the fish. And that makes the chemistry end of the analysis very difficult and challenging. So our chemists here are committed to the job of trying to detect these small levels of these contaminants. And like I said, we have to send most of our samples for the organochlorine contaminants out to an outside laboratory for that very sensitive analysis. Of the two types of contaminants, the metals seem to concentrate more in the fish tissue and the muscle tissue, where the organic contaminants like pesticides and PCBs are more in the fatty tissue. Mercury has been a real concern with fish and fish consumption. And we do see the concentration of mercury, just like the concentration of some of these other contaminants, vary with species of fish. The older, more aggressive, or fish that are higher on the food chain have higher concentration of these. So it's not unusual that we'd find elevated levels in some of these species like shark, salmon shark, lingcod, and some of the very, very large halibut. Fortunately for the salmon species and many of the other species, we're seeing very low levels of contaminants and very low levels of mercury in these fish. So it's been great for the state to come out and recommended unlimited consumption of most species of fish, such as salmon, because of these low level of contaminants in the fish. The good news is that we are finding very low contamination levels in our salmon and in our species of fish throughout Alaska. For example, out of the 38 pesticides that we've analyzed these fish for, there are 12 pesticides that we can't even find in 75% of the salmon and fish that we've collected throughout the state. So we know we've got very low levels of these contaminants here. And that allows us to make a very strong recommendation that we should eat fish, and we should eat a wide variety of fish, and especially the fish that are good for us, like the Alaska salmon, that are high in omega-3 fatty acids and very good source of protein and vitamins and minerals. We know our fish resources are very valuable for both culturally for Native Alaskans, as well as a nutritional source for all people. And we know that we started this project back in 2001 because of the concern for contaminants, as well as for the lack of data that we had from across the state. So we've developed this database of information so that we can use it as a guideline and as a reference, so that we can look at it as a baseline. We can monitor and look at trends in time over time, as well as look at regional differences, and use this for a measure of other concerns that we have with respect to climate change that are going to impact the Arctic and in Alaska.
Traditional foods are an important part of the Alaska Native culture. The gathering, hunting, preserving, and eating of traditional foods such as salmon and wild berries is essential to the Alaska Native diet and a way of life. The Alaska Native Health Consortium recently published a traditional food guide for Alaska Native cancer survivors. Utilization of salmon byproducts could provide additional resources as well as support local economies.
More and more studies are showing that omega-3 fatty acids are playing a protective and beneficial role when it comes to cancer, especially those that are involved in those cancers that are involved with hormones, such as breast and prostate cancer. Omega-3 fatty acids can play a beneficial and protective role.
We received a grant in 2001 from the National Institute of Health to look at risk factors for obesity, diabetes, and heart disease in Yupik Eskimos. We are working with about 1,200 Yupik Eskimos in a region of southwest Alaska about the size of Ohio. It has about 50 villages in it. The village size is on average about 500 people. Everybody lives in these small communities, and they have one store, a school, general office building, things like that. And a lot of people live off the land eating subsistence foods. What is it about Yupik Eskimos that makes it so interesting? There are a lot of things interesting about Yupiks, but in particular their diet, which is rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids that are found in marine mammals and particularly salmon, which is a large part of their subsistence diet. Our center was initially funded in 2001 with a 5-year grant from the NIH. We've since received a follow-up renewal grant showing that our center was important to the NIH. And in this follow-up grant, we have new projects related to diabetes, and some of us, like myself, received additional independent funding to particularly look at the protective effects of polyunsaturated fatty acids that are so rich in salmon and marine mammals that the Yupik Eskimos eat in their normal subsistence diet. So my grant in particular looks at genetic risk factors for obesity and how those genetic risk factors are modified by diet as well as physical activity. In terms of diet, as I said, the Yupik Eskimos eat a lot of salmon, and we've measured polyunsaturated fatty acids in red blood cell membranes from Yupik Eskimos, colleagues of mine, Brett Lewick and Andrea Berseman, and they've found a huge variation in the polyunsaturated fatty acid intake. Some of the levels are a little bit lower than that found in the lower 48, but on average, Yupiks eat about 3 to 5 times as much polyunsaturated fat as a normal Caucasian would find in their diet, and in some people it's 10 to 30 times as much. So why is that important? In terms of obesity, about 70% of the variation in an individual's body weight is genetically influenced. That's not to say that if you have bad genes for obesity that you're going to be obese and there's nothing you can do about it. I like to tell people the genes are the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And so if you have genetic risk factors for obesity, or diabetes for that matter, a lot of what determines whether or not you ultimately get obesity or diabetes is your environment. So our hypothesis with my grant is that polyunsaturated fats in the diet, these fats, the lipids that are found in subsistence foods, are protective against the development of diabetes and heart disease. Some people are curious whether or not some of the polymorphisms we identify in Yupik Eskimos are at all relevant to the general population, and we have lots of evidence to suggest that that's the case. Yupik Eskimos don't have a completely different genotype or genetic makeup than Caucasians do. In fact, there are people that have been doing studies in a consortium called the HapMap, which has identified about 3.6 million genetic polymorphisms, and they've looked at how transportable those polymorphisms are in different populations. And for the most part, they're completely transportable. We don't think the protection from diabetes in Yupiks is because they have a particular genotype that Caucasians don't have. We think actually that Yupiks have a particular environment that we're not seeing in Caucasians because they don't eat the amount of fish and marine mammals that Yupiks eat, and that with supplementation, fish oil tablets or omega-3 fatty acids, some of the same beneficial effects on health might be seen, or probably would be seen, in Caucasians that we see in Yupik Eskimos. Pretty much Yupiks are one of the only remaining ethnic groups that have a very low prevalence of type 2 diabetes in the presence of obesity, the major risk factor for type 2 diabetes. We're trying to understand why are they so special? What are they doing that makes their diabetes prevalence so low? So one of the things the elders asked us over the years are, we've heard that there's mercury contamination in our foods, or that the mine upriver might be dumping something in the water that makes the fish look a little different, or they've seen a sore on the fish. And so we have an investigator, Todd O'Hara, who's specifically looking at the health benefits of subsistence foods versus the contaminant levels in those subsistence foods. And all the preliminary data points to the subsistence food is a very healthy thing to eat, that the contaminant levels are low, and that we're learning different ways of preparing and storing those subsistence foods and how that modifies the level of contaminants in those foods.
Most of Alaska's annual salmon catch, about 500 million pounds, goes to global food markets in various forms, such as canned fish, fillets, headed and gutted whole fish, and eggs, or roe. The parts of the fish not utilized for these markets, called byproduct, add up to 250 million pounds of food-grade salmon and are available for use in new and emerging business opportunities.
In Kodiak, we purchase and process all 5 species of Pacific salmon. King salmon, sockeyes, chums, cohos, and pinks. Majority of our production is similar to the overall statewide production. Majority of our production is pink salmon. If you produce an H&G salmon, there's less waste. If you're doing a fillet product, there's quite a bit more. So it can run from maybe as low as 20 to 25% to perhaps as high as 45 or 50%. So it really depends on the primary product that's being produced.
And just using straight 38% loss from heads, fins, and guts. Sometimes it's a little higher, but using that, we generated approximately almost 400 million pounds of seafood waste, which we call waste, but actually it's not waste unless you look at it as such. The standard discharge method really paints the entire industry, from harvesters to processors to managers, in a relatively unfavorable light of social irresponsibility, because the world is in dire need of marine-based proteins and oils and other nutrients, and here we are dumping 400 million pounds into the ocean.
How can we recover the excess biomass that's being discarded out of processing and lead to byproducts? AFDF looked years ago at the amount of biomass that was available in the pollock industry and led to the Americanization of surimi. We've done a lot of studies in the past with different groups on recovering biomass and recovering fish processing waste. Today, the price of meals and oils has increased significantly. The NPDES permits have become greater, more stringent. The demand for fillets has increased. It's all leading to a question of how do we recover the value of this thousands of metric tons of salmon waste that is being discarded at this point in time.
As long as we continue to look at the salmon byproducts that are generated in the fish plants as garbage and waste to be heaped in piles and birds diving in and flies swarming, we'll never get any value out of them. And we need to stop looking at it like that. If we try to make this product a hydrolysate with very low quality and rotting heads and guts, we would get nowhere.
Quality is so important, as I'm sure Pete and Sandra will tell you as well. Even in a traditional meal plan, the fresh raw material is very important, and how you handle the product is extremely important to get the best prices for your meal and oil.
As we look to the future for ways to optimize the use of Alaska's wild salmon harvest, the importance of such an abundant source of byproducts cannot be overlooked. Changes in Alaska's salmon industry are aimed at maximizing the value of the millions of salmon landed each year and creating market opportunities with new products. Finding cost-effective ways to derive more value from Alaska's salmon waste, such as improved technology and product development, is a goal of Alaska Fisheries Development Foundation and its members.
Super Sockeye Wonder Pills, a cure for damn near all your ills. They're made from salmon running wild and free. From underneath the midnight sun, they're caught by Alaskan fishermen. Omega-3's so good for you and me. Sing with me, Sean. Omega-3s, 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 so wild and so free. Fish oil will protect your mind and help prevent you going blind. It's the very best thing for your heart. But that's not my only point. It will lubricate your joints and will help you make a brand new start. Omega-3s, 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 so wild and so free. It'll pick you up when you're feeling down and help you shed those extra pounds and even help cure your menstrual pain. I'm not making it up. Nope. So my friends, it's no joke. It's the antidote for strokes. You've nothing to lose and all to gain. Sing with me, everybody. Omega-3s, 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 so wild and so free. Oh, super psych wonder pills, a cure for damn near all your ills. They're made from salmon, running wild and free.